at the end of 2011, as the bull market started to head down into a bear market, by 2017 we saw capitulation on many levels, not only with the retail investor, but also the central banks. Central banks were selling their gold. It really never made a whole lot of sense to me. And by 2017, we were at really the peak of the bear market in precious metals, and this was when Bitcoin was taking off. And there were a lot of people selling their gold, and talks of central banks divesting of gold and investing in treasuries or income-producing assets. And then out of nowhere, a story popped up that the Bundesbank had been trying to repatriate their gold for a few years, but started to really make a big deal of it in 2017. It caught my eye. Why would they want to repatriate their gold from the New York Fed in the midst of what seemed to be a movement away from precious metals and into other forms of investment? It was very interesting they made such a big deal, and within a few weeks of that, you had the Bank of Turkey and the Bank of Austria and the Dutch National Bank and the Czech National Bank and the Bank of Poland, and all of these banks, the Bank of Hungary, they were all saying, send us our gold back, not just from the New York Fed, but also from the Bank of England. And so it began a movement that really caught my eye. And now in 2018, the following year, this really accentuated when those same banks bought more gold as a group than they did in the 60 years previously combined. Now I'm starting to get really interested and really aware of what was happening. 2019 comes along, those numbers jump by almost 100%, north of 90%. The accumulation of gold by these central banks, which, was out of nowhere, really, if we look back over the previous decade. And then the Bank of International Settlements came out with the declaration of revaluing gold as a high-quality liquid asset. Now, there's been some dispute, is it a tier one or is it a high-quality liquid asset? In the end, they're the same thing. It's as good as cash. When it's a hedged position, it is viewed by the Bank of International Settlements as good as cash. And I think if you look at that and realize that the acquisition of gold and the repatriation of gold, which was almost two and a half years prior to this admission, you wonder, were they clued in on the revaluation of gold or on the reclassification of it? Were they told, get your house in order, repatriate your gold, you might want to stop buying it because we're going to reclassify it as good as cash? So this really started to get me interested in what was happening, and they were not. This was all part of the Basel III. Whether or not they were left out of it or they just decided not to do it or accumulated other ways, it is, I guess, debatable. And you wonder where Gaddafi's gold is, where Saddam Hussein's gold is. Just saying, the Ukraine sold out of $25 billion worth of gold to fund the war. Where did that go? So I don't know where the U.S., if the U.S. was accumulating gold or if they weren't, or if they were getting it in other ways. But the U.S. certainly wasn't part of the narrative. These were all the Eastern European banks. And ironically, most of the banks that were doing it were either part of the European Union or in that general region, but most of them did not trade the euro. They traded their own currency within the European Union. So these are the banks that I believe ultimately will shift towards the BRICS nations. I digress. 2020, I start to notice the second very interesting piece of the puzzle, and that was the Chinese Belt Road and Rail Initiative. And this is the largest infrastructure project in human history, and it's connecting Asia and Africa and parts of South America and Europe, the old Silk Road. And I'm looking at it and realizing that all 13 OPEC producing countries are on the Belt Road. Almost 70% of human population and 40% of global GDP on this growing group of countries, and it's all void of US dollar participation. Most of it settling on the new Chinese digital yuan. And so it started to get I started to get this feeling that, look, a lot of the countries that are part of the Belt Road, China and India and Russia, and these are countries that are accumulating all of the gold and producing all of the gold. And you start to see this growing group of countries and kind of the isolation of the dollar. Now, this really didn't all fit into what I was talking about until shortly after 2021. 2020, the banks are still buying gold. And 2021 rolls around and we see the day that we leave Afghanistan in a very unharmonious way. Saudi Arabia, I think, at that point, signed the death warrant for the end of the petrodollar the day we left Afghanistan or the day after. And I think there is no coincidence in the timing. Saudi Arabia announces a joint military cooperation agreement with Russia. Leaving our own servicemen and women behind enemy lines was something that would have been considered inconceivable in the United States that I grew up in. And I think that really signaled something to our allies and certainly to our foes. I asked people what makes the dollar the world reserve currency, and most people don't know. But in 1974, 3 years after we closed the gold window, Kissinger went to Saudi Arabia and struck a deal with the Saudi kingdom and said, hey, we'll protect you, but for that, you'll denominate oil globally in dollars. And they have through OPEC. And this has created a massive synthetic demand for the dollar for the last 50 years. Signaling a change in that by a joint military cooperation agreement with Russia was a huge move that got very little, if any, attention in the Western media. But now things are really starting to click in for me, and I'm starting to see not only global de-dollarization, but also groupings that are growing together, like all 13 of the OPEC producing countries on the Belt Road, like shortly thereafter, China and Nigeria, who also signed the same contract with Russia, selling their gold to China for the petro-yuan bond, which is immediately convertible into gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange. And this is how countries like Iran have sidestepped sanctions for quite some time, selling their oil to China for a bond that is immediately convertible into gold, and they take possession of it right off the Shanghai Gold Exchange. So these things are starting to speed up at this point, and I'm really starting to notice that there's a growing group of countries that are formulating around the BRICS that are, I think, coalescing against the dollar, the hypocrisy, the hegemony of the dollar, and you could see it, you could feel it, and you could watch all of the gold that was being sent eastward, and the accumulation and the de-dollarization. 2022 rolls along, and the weaponization of the dollar, as you mentioned, where I believe it's not the prerogative of the West to say who can and can't use the world reserve currency. It should be more for public opinion, not for the administrator of the currency to decide who can and can't use it. And it was that moment, and I often ask people, do you think this was intended? We have 130 trillion in debt, 31 trillion that's on balance sheet, and Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, which is 55 trillion underfunded in and of itself, and government military pensions, render us insolvent. Most of this debt accumulated at the lowest interest rates in human history. Was it intended? Did we want to pick a villain to create this great reset, to all of a sudden start the de-dollarization? And this is where the story gets very interesting as it turns from here. That is part of the equation. That's a fair statement. This was before the Ukraine invasion, number one. And secondly, the day after these announcements came out, Zero Hedge ran an article saying Saudi Arabia announces to the world that their nuclear submarines are outfitted with hypersonic ICBMs. This is the technology the West doesn't have. The State Department commented and said they're very concerned about it. These are the missiles that can go Mach 10 up in the atmosphere and hit the ground at the speed of an asteroid. That was, I think, their way of saying, don't even try to do what you did to Gaddafi and Hussein. Don't even think about it. It was a veiled threat, let's say. And I think this is another reason why when you realize that also last year we see the Saudis say, well, we have submitted our application to the BRICS.